Hi everyone, I'm Bryan Stenson, and I'll be presenting on Chapter 6, Section 1 on musical development and education. Even though I'll be focusing on Section 1 of this chapter, I think it helps to get an overview of the whole chapter to put everything in context. This chapter discusses the interrelated topics of musical development and education. Prominent studies in this field include Hargreaves, Delige and Sloboda, and McPherson. The chapter is in two big sections. Section 1 covers the social perspective of musical development, and Section 2 covers the field of music education. One more thing to consider when looking at everything presented in this chapter is that perspectives on cognitive development have shifted dramatically in the past 3 decades. Butterworth proposes 3 main phases of cognitive development studies. Phase 1 is Piagetian theory. Phase 2 is interpersonal context of thinking. And then Phase 3 is situated cognition. This is also known as the knowledge that is acquired through physical and social contexts. When discussing thoughts and theories of cognitive development, it's helpful to relate those ideas back to these 3 phases. It is also important to recognize that views on cognitive development, especially in the arts, is sometimes at odds with each other and is also ever-changing. When it comes to musical development, the socio-cultural perspective has become one of the most dominant approaches when studying developmental and educational psychology. The book cites 2 of the founding fathers of this discipline, Piaget and Vygotsky. Hargreaves and North then discuss the developments after Piaget and Vygotsky, and then lastly goes into detail about the cultural historical activity theory, or CHAT. Piaget and Vygotsky were 2 instrumental figures in the development of cognitive development theory, but there are many differences between their viewpoints and sometimes they are at odds with each other. One of Jean Piaget's main arguments on cognitive development was that individuals assimilate to the social world around them to their own thinking. His viewpoint was that children are like mini scientists whose cognition develops in common developmental sequences universally across all children. Lev Vygotsky, on the other hand, argues that social relationships actually determine an individual's thinking, meaning the social world around the child affects how the child develops cognition. 3 concepts that affect cognition that he outlines are action, language, and social setting. Vygotsky's view of outside factors being the prominent driver of a child's cognitive development places more prominence on the relationship between the student and the teacher in comparison to Piaget. Another difference between Piaget and Vygotsky is the concept of zone of proximal development, a Vygotsky concept that is defined as the discrepancy between the child's actual level of performance on a task at a given point in time and his or her potential level of performance on that task given appropriate instruction. This differs from Piaget's view, who proposes self-paced activity by the learner. Again, Piaget views children as mini scientists who all develop in stages at a universal level. Piaget also viewed children under 7 as egocentric, therefore learning had to involve conflict as the child was forced to listen to the instructions of the teacher. ZPD, on the other hand, views learning being a cooperative interaction. Therefore, learning is achieved through cooperation and not conflict. Since music is generally a cooperative activity, whether in an ensemble, general music class, or even in private lessons, ZPD has an important bearing on the explanation of musical development. From Piaget and Vygotsky, future researchers have expanded upon their ideas and their viewpoints. Some major concepts that have developed from their theories include speed of processing, modularity, guided participation, communities of practice, and legitimate peripheral participation. Speed of processing can be thought of how quickly people can extract information from their environment. It has been observed that the speed of processing information increases with age. Children are slower than adults in this respect, probably because they have a more limited working memory. As we grow up, our experiences and memories compound on top of each other, and we're sort of downloading information that helps us create a more complex mental model. More information allows us to process information around our environment more quickly. A musical example of this can be observed in sight reading. Good sight readers are better able than poor sight readers to recognize patterns or structures within a musical score. This also enables them to process the information contained in the score much more quickly. Modularity is best defined as different aspects of knowledge developing at different speeds and in different ways because of the diverse cultural environments in which this occurs. This differs from Piaget's view on a global development where everything happens in stages at the same time. Modularity argues that development and learning is probably more domain specific, so you have a certain area of your cognition that develops a certain task at its own rate. Musical skills may develop at a different time or pace from language skills or even movement skills. Something that has helped me understand modularity is to think of our cognition like a computer with different aspects or tasks or skill sets being different applications or programs in our computer, and each of these applications having to be updated at different times from each other. This is not to say, however, that these domains or programs in our brain are completely independent from each other, and Carmiloff-Smith even argues that we should go beyond modularity and look into these specific domains maybe being interrelated. Guided participation is a concept that may be best used to describe what happens in teaching. There are four main characteristics. The first being that teachers act as a link between the knowledge of the learner and the demands of the task. Teachers provide an overall structure and context in which the learner can find a solution and not lose sight of the learning goal. Guided problem solving allows learners to be more active in finding solutions. Over time, responsibility transfers from the teacher to the learner as the learner continues to learn more on how to take on the responsibility of. Communities of practice can be simply thought as the way of doing things. They are social and cultural in nature and have three main characteristics. They have a shared domain of knowledge, they have a community of people who care about this domain, and the shared practice develops to be effective within that domain. What comes most to mind, of course, is ensembles. For example, in a choir, a shared domain of knowledge would be the choral music. The community of people that care about this domain would be the singers, and the shared practice that develops to be effective in the domain is the singing and the rehearsals. Legitimate peripheral participation doesn't necessarily involve teacher-to-learner interaction, but rather learner-to-learner interaction. It was a concept developed by Lave and Wenger and relates to how learners participate within communities of practice. This type of learning usually occurs in groups. It's not considered individual, however, individual development may occur within a group. It involves learning from other learners. Peers can have powerful influences as pedagogues in musical learning and development. What this makes me think of is in how some high school ensembles, upperclassmen can act as a mentor to freshmen and sophomores within the same ensemble, offering advice or helping out with learning music or putting on their bow tie or uniform, how to hold up their trumpet, and also relaying the expectations of being within an ensemble. Cultural historical activity theory, or CHAT, examines how people react to objects in their environment through the mediation of cultural tools. Cultural tools can be internal, meaning symbolic in nature, like languages or concepts, or external, meaning something more physical or written out, like in a book or in a computer. We don't respond to objects directly in this theory, but rather through cultural references and norms, which act as our cultural tools. Chat is derived from Vygotskian ideals, and Engstrom outlines 3 generations of chat research. He outlines the first generation as, of course, Vygotsky, with a subject interacting with an object through a cultural tool. This is exemplified in figure 6.1 on the right. The second generation he outlines is A.N. Leontev. More importantly, the third generation is by Engstrom himself and associates, and they add more elements to Vygotsky's basic mediational model of a subject interacting with an object through the mediation of a cultural tool. The book outlines an example of chat in action with the example of a school band rehearsal. The subject is the first rehearsal of the semester. It is everyone's first time in this new ensemble, but they understand the rules of the classroom and how a rehearsal should work. It is those rules of the classroom, the cultural and social rules and norms, that act as the cultural tool in which they will mediate through to interact with the object, which is the piece of music that they will be rehearsing. While they are gradually learning about the piece, they also learn about each other. They adapt to each other's playing styles and internalize aspects of this domain. They then begin to improve and expand on the music being made. This can lead to innovation and change in ways that they work together. So far, we've only talked about cultural and social influences, but are there biological predispositions in cognitive development? Development involving the interaction between biological predispositions and the social environment are best seen in studies of infants and mother socialization in the past 30 years, most notably by Trehoev. Mothers interact with their newborns in ways that are biologically determined. Babies also lead in this interaction by crying or smiling, causing the mother to respond accordingly. Mothers then attach meaning to the cries and the smiles of their babies, and then babies begin to attach meaning to their mother's facial expressions, vocalizations, and movements. Mother and child mutually create meanings to these interactions, and the child begins to make sense of the world. Trevarthan argues that this process is inherently musical, proposing the concept of communicative musicality. One thing that this makes me think of personally is the use of lullabies and nursery rhymes by mothers when comforting their children or putting them to sleep. An important question to consider is if musical development proceeds in stages. Piaget viewed development as occurring in steps. This is considered problematic nowadays because there is doubtful functionality of step-based development theory. There is also no common goal or endpoint of musical development which is reached by all, and it does not take into account social and cultural diversity quite enough. However, Parsons still used this theory as a basis for his stage-based view on musical development. An opposing view, a more common view, is the symbol style of theories. This describes the acquisition and the use of symbols as being central to artistic development. Gardner highlights 3 waves of symbolization, the first being enactive representation, which is through physical actions, which is observed in infancy. The second is mapping, which is achieved through make-believe play and drawings, roughly occurring around 3 years old. And lastly, digital mapping, where symbols start to correspond with the outside. Another thing we must consider is if musical development is domain-specific. Piaget's view is that stages apply across all art forms. In the symbol system, development is domain-specific. Modularity asks if domains are interrelated or interdependent from each other. Karmeloff-Smith argues that we must move beyond modularity and that domain-specific skills in music do exist, but they can be integrated into other aspects of musical and cognitive development. There are some big educational implications that derive from these views. Modularity advocates argue that different art subjects should be integrated as a whole, such as writing, music, painting, drama, and dance combining together to create a better arts development package. Domain-specific advocates argue that a discipline-based arts education is necessary for artistic development. Maybe the answer is both, somehow combining a general arts education with a domain-specific one. When it comes to artistic development, there are two types, normative and expert. Normative development is enculturation. They are the age-related developments that happen without any effort or direction. Children learn through social and cultural influences, such as general music classes, nursery rhymes, pop songs, or playground games. They can still learn very sophisticated musical concepts, such as the ability to process pitch, rhythm, and harmony. This happens without specific training. Sloboda argues that, in a way, through enculturation, everyone can become a musical expert in terms of perception, but not necessarily in action. In expert development, Sloboda comes to four conclusions: that skills are dependent on the ability of the performer to detect structures within music, that skills depend mostly on the amount of time that you practice more than any other factor, skills become automatic through practice, and that these skills tend to be domain-specific. For example, violin playing technique does not correspond with trumpet playing technique. There are many models and theories in the modern age that examine musical development. Hargreaves and Zimmerman have outlined four trends or shifts of opinion regarding developmental theories. The first is moving away from the notional of universal developmental stages. The second is moving towards a search for universals in cognitive function. The third is moving towards symbolic representation. And lastly, moving away from the views of Piaget and more towards Vygotsky, with emphasis on the role of the teacher. There has also been a growing interest in the self-perception of the learner and the teacher. This asks, how does the relationship between the teacher and the student affect their musical identity? Are teachers solely responsible for a student's musical identity? Are there any biological predispositions that have influence? Hargreaves, Meal, and MacDonald argue yes and yes. They state that musical identities originate in biological predispositions and are later shaped by other people, experiences, and society within a particular culture. So they argue that people already have a biological predisposition or talent, and then it takes others around them through teaching, musical experiences, or communities of practice to help influence how they identify musically. This view can explain how a person's view of themselves can affect their motivations in a domain like music. That is my presentation for Chapter 6.1.